Right, the primer problem. I had terrible issues with this gun when I first got it because the cylinder would jam pretty much every second shot. And it went back to Alan, who converts them, because I thought the cylinder was out of spec. It wasn't. Well, it kind of wasn't. The whole gun never went back to him. I just sent the cylinder back, and he kindly checked it for me and testified it, said it was okay. And I was still getting problems where it would bind up every second or third shot or so. And after extensive investigation, what it turned out to be wasn't what we thought it was. What it was is it's very finely made tolerances on this cylinder, and one, it needs to be absolutely clean to use. So if you get any build-up of carbon or anything on this shaft, which the cylinder rotates on, particularly here, which would stop it going down to its end point, that can cause problems. The cylinder gap is very, very tight. I can't remember what the measurement was. It was at the lower end of acceptability, but that's good for accuracy. But the cylinder gap isn't the problem. The cylinder wasn't catching on the barrel, which I thought initially might have been the issue. It wasn't timing and it wasn't lock-up. And to be fair, there's absolutely nothing wrong with the timing or lock-up on this gun at all. And it's very accurate when it fires. What it was the primers. Now, take the cylinder off. This is how you load it, being a muzzle loading nitro revolver. Alan has these cylinders made. They're CNC machined, and these need to be kept reasonably clean certainly on this back surface where the primers go. It's ignited by shotgun primers, as you probably all know. And the only primers I've got to hand are Remington, because I've got 1,000 of them and they work great in my other muzzle loader, the 1858 New Model Army nitro conversion. Now, what we found was, with these primers, you notice one of them is marked fat and one's marked thin. There's a reason for that. They're not all the same. So if I take out 3 fat primers, these are fat ones, and if I offer them up to the primer pocket, very difficult to show on camera. In fact, it probably won't. In fact, you won't be able to see it. But if I run my finger and my thumb over the primer pocket, this one's actually okay. This one I've picked. Sod's bloody low. This one's all right. There's 1 or 2 primer pockets on here where it won't sit absolutely flush. That one. You can feel it when you run your thumb around the circumference. You can feel the edge of the primer. It's very, very, very slight. Probably less than, I don't know. You can just see it sticking up. It's less than 1/10 of a millimetre, probably maybe 1/20 of a mil. You know, we're talking less than a width of a human hair. But that protrusion of that primer is enough to bind up that revolver when it fires. It's enough to bind it solid. And what I found is the primers aren't all the same depth, if you like. Okay. So what I simply do now, before I take primers out, I'll do this. I'll put a primer in the pocket. There's this particular pocket which has a dent next to it, where it locked up, and the primer, firing pin struck the side of the cylinder. This one in particular is known to cause problems, so that's kind of my test one. If it sits flush in this chamber, it'll sit flush in all of them. So what I'll do, I'll just pop a primer in. Does that one work? Yes. And if it works, I'll put it in the thin pile. If it doesn't work, I'll put it in the fat pile. Simple as that. And with the thin primers, no problems, 100% reliable, no problem at all. With the fat primers, it'll bind up every time. Now I can use the fat ones in my other revolver, so I'm not worried about that. And what I find is it's about 2/3 of the primers are thin and 1/3 are fat on the Remingtons. So the difference is only certainly less than 1/20 of a millimetre in height of primer, but that's enough. And of course you've got to keep the primer pockets reasonably clean. Now, crud building up in the bottom of the pocket isn't really an issue. So if anything builds up in the bottom here, inside the pocket, so let me get a close-up for you. There you go. If anything builds up in the bottom, inside, that's not an issue because that's really, really deep anyway. There's plenty of clearance there. Although I've just cleaned this one and it's absolutely clean, as you can see. But it doesn't matter. As long as the flash hole's clear, you're alright. Where it does matter is here on the flange, for want of a better term, where the lip of the primer sits. A very good friend of mine called Steve. Hi Steve, you alright mate? Has a lathe and an end mill, and an end mill and a very good quality pillar drill. And by hand, he milled out an extra 1/20 of a mil or so depth on these flanges. And all that's done, it's allowed the primers to sit that fraction deeper. Now we did check all of this before we start taking any metal off, that the firing pin would still have enough oomph, if you like, to hit the primers after we'd removed that metal. And we tested that with fired primers, and we measured how deep the indentation was in the fired primer, and that told us how deep the firing pin would go. And as it happens, it's actually pretty generous. So we knew we could take certainly a 1/10, maybe a 1/20 of a millimetre extra depth on these pockets, and I think Steve put an extra 1/10 of a mil on. He's not here to ask, but he'll remind me. And that just made most of the primers sit flush. The other thing he made for me is, out of a bit of scrap steel here, is effectively a cleaner. It's just got a couple of cross hatches in it. It's just a bit of old screw bar, but it's exactly the right diameter to fit inside the lip of the primer pocket, and just do that, and it takes all the carbon off, and it keeps that primer pocket nice and clean. So maybe every 20 or 30 shots or so, I'll just quickly go around all the primer pockets with this little tool he made for me, and it keeps them nice and clean. And that's it. I have found I can go certainly 50-60 shots on this, no problem. Wipe the cylinder down every 30 shots or so with a rag with a bit of Brunox on it or something, just to keep it clean. Same with the front surface, I'll wipe that down, and it's no problem at all. So that's solved my problem I had where the primers were binding up, and this gun runs pretty reliably now. I'm actually fairly happy with it. The only thing you've got to do, as Alan will tell you if you buy the gun from him, you've got to keep the spindle clean on the crane where the cylinder rides. You've got to keep the inside channel where that spindle goes clean down here. Again, just Q-tips will be fine. And one other thing I've noticed as well, when the gun's firing after about 20 rounds, the crane, because it's a custom crane, due to UK laws you can't retro convert this back to normal cartridge firing, so he's had to build modify the crane. This becomes a little bit loose, and it's actually held in place by the normal grub screw here, and then there's a little pin. You can put the primer clearing tool it gives you through this hole, and that hole stops the nut spinning round. Then you can just give that a little tighten up with a screwdriver, just to keep stop the crane from wobbling backwards and forwards. I find you've got to do that about every 20-30 rounds or so. It's no trouble to do it. That's it. So that's how I solved my dodgy issue with the gun locking up every third or fourth shot, and it was all down to clearance of the primers at the back. So, job done.